I was 12 when I learned what exhaustion really meant. While other kids played baseball after school, I was carrying bricks on construction sites. My hands were calloused long before I ever held a pen. Every sunrise smelled like dust and sweat, and every dollar I made went toward survival. Back then, I didn't dream of vacations or new shoes. I dreamed of a full plate of food and a dry roof that didn't leak when it rained. Life had a simple rhythm: work, save, repeat. When my son David was born, that rhythm turned into a purpose. I remember holding him in my arms, tiny and fragile, promising myself that his life would never look like mine. He would study, eat well, and wear clean shoes to school. I'd take the weight so he could walk freely. I worked double shifts at the factory, then took night jobs cleaning stores just to afford formula and diapers. When I couldn't buy both food and electricity, I chose food. I told myself hunger is temporary, but dignity isn't. Every sacrifice I made quietly. There was no applause, no thank you, but I didn't need one. Seeing David laugh when I came home covered in grease and dust was enough. That was my reward. When he started school, I saved for his first uniform. I skipped lunch for a week to afford it. I still remember the way he smiled when I handed him those shiny new shoes. It made the blisters on my feet feel worth it. Over time, I bought him his first bike, then his first car, each one paid for by cutting deeper into my own needs. I used to tell myself that's what fathers do. Love in my eyes was measured by how much pain you were willing to carry for someone else. Neighbors sometimes said I was spoiling him. I didn't care. I believed love would teach gratitude, that blood meant loyalty, that someday David would look at me and say, "Dad, you've done enough. Let me take care of you now." That belief kept me going through winter shifts and sleepless nights. I thought family was unbreakable, that respect was automatic between father and son. Looking back, I realize how blind I was. You can give someone everything, time, sweat, money, your best years, but if you never teach them humility, they grow up thinking they deserve it all. Still, back then, I didn't know that. I was just a tired father trying to buy his child a better future, thinking love alone could hold a family together. As David grew older, my pride grew with him. Watching him finish college felt like watching the first sunrise after years of rain. I told myself all those long shifts and aching nights had finally paid off. When he got his first job, I felt 10 feet tall. When he married the woman he loved, I stood at that wedding in a borrowed suit, smiling like the richest man alive. My wife and I lived modestly, but I wanted David to have more, the kind of start in life I never had. So when he and his wife wanted to buy a house, I used my retirement savings for the down payment. I told him it was a gift, but in my heart, I believed it was an investment in family. I thought if I gave him the foundation, he would build the future. Later, when he talked about joint bank accounts, I didn't hesitate. I thought sharing would teach him responsibility. I thought having his name next to mine would make him feel proud, not entitled. I believed transparency would build trust, not destroy it. So I signed the papers. His name joined mine on every account, every property, every plan for the years ahead. He started handling some of the bills, transferring money when needed. It felt good at first, like we were a team, father and son working side by side. I didn't notice the subtle shift in tone when he began saying things like "our house" or "my savings." I thought it was just a habit of speech. I didn't realize the line between mine and his was slowly disappearing. I sold my old watch to help him buy his first car. I told him not to worry about paying me back. I wanted him to feel secure. I wanted him to know I trusted him fully. In my mind, that was love-giving without keeping score. I thought that if I kept showing faith in him, he'd learn how to be dependable. But trust, when one-sided, becomes a quiet trap. I didn't see it at the time. I was too busy convincing myself that this was what good fathers do. I thought that by giving him everything, I was giving him a sense of duty. In reality, I was giving him power he wasn't ready for. Sometimes I'd catch my wife looking at me with worry in her eyes. She'd ask, "John, are you sure about all this?" I'd laugh it off. "He's our son," I'd say. "He wouldn't let us down." It felt good to believe that. It made the sacrifices easier to swallow. Looking back now, I see how naive that was. I confused trust with surrender. Every document I signed with both our names on it was another thread tying my future to his mercy. I didn't know it yet, but the safety I thought I was building for him was slowly turning into a cage for me. If someone had told me then to keep one account in my own name, to set boundaries, to teach him to earn instead of receive, I might have listened, or maybe I wouldn't have. Love blinds you that way. You don't realize you're handing someone the power to hurt you until it's too late. Still, at that moment, I was proud. I had done what fathers are told to do: provide, protect, prepare. What I didn't understand was that protecting your child sometimes means protecting them from your own generosity. It didn't happen overnight. That's the thing about disrespect. It doesn't come crashing through the door. It slips in quietly like a draft under the window. At first I brushed it off. David was busy, stressed from work, juggling bills and kids. I told myself he was just tired when he started answering me with short, distracted replies. When I tried to tell him about the old days, how I used to walk miles to work just to save bus fare, he'd roll his eyes and say I'd told that story 100 times. I laughed it off the first few times. Maybe I had told it too often. But something inside me hurt a little each time he said it. Soon it wasn't just impatience. It was tone. The way he'd talk to me like I was in the way, like listening to me, was a chore. When I asked for help picking up my medication, he sighed loud enough for the neighbors to hear. If I asked him for a ride to the clinic, he'd complain about gas prices. I wanted to remind him that I paid for the car he was driving, that I once worked double shifts to fill its first tank. But I stayed quiet. His wife started following his lead. When I coughed at night, she shouted from her room that old people should live in nursing homes if they couldn't sleep silently. David laughed. That laughter hit harder than any insult. It was a reminder that I was no longer seen as a father, but as a burden. The grandchildren started copying what they saw. They giggled when I walked slowly or dropped something. They stopped listening when I spoke. I couldn't blame them. Children learn from what they witness. But it broke something in me to see the seeds of disrespect passed down like a family tradition. I noticed other small things too. If I ate a little extra rice, David would joke about me costing more than his kids. Once he said it while the whole family was at the table. Everyone laughed except me. I smiled on the outside, but inside I felt like I was shrinking. I remembered the nights I skipped dinner so he could eat more. Those memories used to make me proud. Now they made me ache. I started spending more time alone in my room. Silence became safer than conversation. Every word I said seemed to annoy him, so I said less. Every step I took felt like a disturbance, so I moved slower. It's strange, the quieter I became, the louder the house seemed to grow without me. Their laughter, their television, their conversations, all reminders that I no longer belonged in the home I built. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the window and hardly recognize the man staring back. My shoulders were bent not from age, but from carrying too much disappointment. I used to think silence was dignity. I thought keeping the peace meant protecting the family. But peace built on humiliation isn't peace, it's surrender. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself love means patience and patience means endurance. But deep down, I could feel something shifting, not just in my heart, but in the walls of that house. The foundation I built for love and respect was starting to crack. And like every crack in a house, it began small, almost invisible. But I should have known the longer you ignore a crack, the more it spreads. It was an ordinary evening, the kind of quiet that makes you think life is still holding together. Dinner was simple rice, vegetables, and the faint noise of the grandchildren playing with their spoons instead of eating. I sat at the same end of the table I always did, waiting for everyone to be served before I took my portion. It was a habit I'd built over time, one that came from learning not to reach too early, not to take up too much space. When my bowl was finally passed to me, I scooped a small serving of rice, enough to fill the hunger without inviting comment. But that night, for reasons I still can't explain, I felt just a little hungrier. I looked across the table and saw there was still some rice left in the bowl, so I asked gently if I could have a little more. The room went still. It was the kind of silence that doesn't last long but feels heavy enough to bend the air. David looked up from his plate, his expression twisting as if I'd said something outrageous. He didn't speak. He just picked up the glass of water beside his plate, reached across the table, and poured it straight into my face. The shock was cold and immediate. The water stung my eyes, soaked through my shirt, and dripped down onto my plate, turning the rice into a pale mush. For a few seconds I couldn't move. My hands trembled not from fear but disbelief. Around me no one spoke. My daughter-in-law gave a nervous laugh, the kind people make when they don't want to pick a side. The grandchildren stared wide-eyed but curious, as if they were watching a scene from a movie, not a humiliation. David finally broke the silence, saying in a low, sharp voice that cut deeper than the water ever could, "That's enough. Stop acting like a king in my house." His words didn't echo. They just sank. I wiped my face with a napkin, trying to steady my breath. I didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't even stand up right away. I just sat there feeling the wet fabric cling to my skin, while the laughter from the other end of the table returned awkward and forced. In that moment, something inside me went quiet. My dignity didn't vanish with the water it hardened. I thought about every night I came home from work, too tired to eat every coin I saved so he could go to school every time I skipped a meal so he wouldn't have to. Those memories didn't comfort me anymore. They felt like scars I had mistaken for medals. The humiliation wasn't in the act itself, it was in the ease of it, in how natural it seemed to him. I realized this wasn't a moment of anger. It was a moment of truth. My son didn't see me as a father anymore. He saw me as an old man taking up space at his table. I stood up slowly, the chair legs scraping against the floor, a sound louder than anything said that night. I didn't look at him. I didn't look at anyone. I just turned and walked back to my room. Behind me, I could hear the clinking of dishes, soft laughter, life going on, as if nothing had happened. Inside my room, I sat on the edge of my bed, water still dripping from my hair. I stared at my hands, the same hands that once built his home, held his head when he cried, and carried him across flooded streets so his shoes wouldn't get wet. Now they shook, not from weakness, but from the weight of what I finally understood. Water dries, clothes dry, but a man's dignity, once washed away in front of his own family, never truly dries again. That night I didn't cry. I didn't even sleep. I just sat there listening to the sound of laughter through the walls and felt something deep inside me shift. My silence wasn't submission anymore. It was the sound of something breaking quietly, completely. I didn't know it then, but that moment, cold, wet, and painfully calm, was the exact second my story began to change. That night the house was quiet, but my mind wasn't. I sat on the edge of my bed, still wearing the damp shirt that clung to my skin. Every drop of water that had dried from my face seemed to leave behind a heavier thought. Outside my door, I could hear faint laughter from the living room. They were still talking, still eating, as if nothing had happened. It amazed me how quickly humiliation can turn invisible when it isn't theirs to feel. I didn't move for a long time. My hands rested on my knees, trembling not from age this time, but from something sharper: anger, sadness, clarity. I looked around my small room, the same one I'd been given when I moved in. It was meant to be a place of rest, but it had become a waiting room for my own fading dignity. That night I realized I wasn't resting. I was trapped. I reached for the drawer beside my bed and pulled out an old folder filled with papers I hadn't looked at in years. Bank statements, property deeds, insurance documents, all neatly stacked untouched. As I ran my fingers over them, something inside me shifted. Every signature on those papers carried my name. Every account, every property, every investment, still legally mine. David didn't know that. He thought joint meant ownership. He thought my trust was surrender. But the truth was, I had never given up control. I had only shared access, never authority. The more I read, the calmer I became. It wasn't revenge that filled me. It was understanding. Power hadn't left me. I had just forgotten where I'd placed it. The night that started with humiliation was turning into something else, a reckoning. I remembered the years I'd spent working under the rain, lifting bricks with frozen fingers, saving for his education, his house, his comfort. For so long I'd believed that love meant giving without limit. But now I saw what I should have taught instead, that love has boundaries, and respect grows where boundaries are kept. The silence around me grew heavier, but it no longer felt empty. It felt strategic. For the first time in years, I wasn't helpless. I had something stronger than anger clarity. I folded the papers carefully, placed them back into the folder, and rested it on my lap. I thought about my next move. There would be no shouting, no confrontation, no scene at the dinner table. Words couldn't fix what had been broken. Only action could. I sat there until dawn, letting the plan take shape in my mind. It was simple but final. I wasn't going to beg for respect anymore. I wasn't going to stay in a house built on contempt. I would take back what was mine, quietly, completely. That night I learned something I should have known long ago. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's preparation. And as the first light of morning crept through the curtains, I understood one last truth that gave me peace. I wasn't powerless. I had simply chosen not to act, until now. Morning came soft and gray. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the slow creak of the wooden floor under my feet. I moved quietly, not wanting to wake anyone. Every step I took felt lighter than the night before, as if the decision itself had already begun to lift the weight off my shoulders. I sat at my small desk, the folder of papers laid out neatly in front of me. Bank accounts, property deeds, investment documents, every page marked with my signature. For years I had treated these papers as symbols of trust. That morning they became my map to freedom. I called the bank as soon as they opened. The manager, a man I'd known for years, recognized my voice immediately. We exchanged polite greetings before I asked him to confirm the account details. He hesitated for a moment, probably sensing the seriousness in my tone. When he told me that I remained the sole primary holder, something inside me settled. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vengeful. I was calm, calmer than I had been in a very long time. I scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. When I arrived, the manager greeted me respectfully, his tie perfectly straight, his words careful. He led me to his office, and I sat across from him as he brought out the documents. I explained what I wanted to do: transfer every dollar from the joint accounts into a new private account in my name only. No shared access, no joint signatures, complete separation. He looked at me as if he wanted to ask why, but he didn't. Maybe he already knew. Maybe he'd seen this kind of quiet resolve before, the kind that comes after a lifetime of endurance. He handed me the papers and I began to sign. Each stroke of my pen felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I had given away. By the time the last page was signed, $3.1 million had moved into my new account. David's name was erased from every record. His access cards would stop working before dinner. As I stood up to leave, the manager said softly, "You've done the right thing, Mr. John." I nodded. It wasn't about right or wrong anymore, it was about peace. Outside, the air felt fresher. I walked slowly down the sidewalk, the afternoon sun warming my back. People hurried past me, busy with their errands, their lives unaware that a quiet revolution had just taken place. I wasn't shaking from anger or pride. I felt still. The kind of stillness that comes only when you finally stop waiting for someone else to value what you've built. I returned home without saying a word to anyone. David was sitting on the couch watching television, laughing at something on the screen. His world was still intact, but not for long. I poured myself a glass of water, sat across from him for a few moments, and just watched. He didn't look up. That silence was enough for me to know I didn't owe him an explanation. After dinner, I packed a small suitcase. Just the essentials. Some clothes, my passport, my medicines, and the folder of documents. I had already booked a one-way ticket to a coastal town overseas, a place no one would think to look for me. I didn't tell anyone. Not my friends, not my neighbors, not even the relatives who might ask questions later. The less they knew, the more peaceful my departure would be. There was no rage in me anymore, only relief. I realized that revenge wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was about correction, restoring what had been taken, even if the thief carried your last name. As I zipped my suitcase, I looked around the room one last time. This house, once filled with pride and warmth, had become a monument to misplaced trust. Every wall carried memories that no longer comforted me. I smiled faintly, not out of happiness, but out of acceptance. My plan was simple: take back what was mine and walk away without noise. No arguments, no warnings, no goodbyes. Because some lessons can't be taught through words, they have to be felt through loss. By the next sunrise, David's cards would decline. His accounts would show zeros, and his laughter would fade into disbelief. But I wouldn't be there to see it. My justice didn't need witnesses. It just needed closure. I turned off the light, placed my suitcase by the door, and sat quietly for a while. My heart didn't race, my mind didn't waver. I had made peace with my choice. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. I had learned that some wars are fought not with fists or words, but with signatures. And that day I won mine with the calm stroke of a pen. The morning arrived quietly, the kind of dawn that feels almost sacred. The air was cool and thin, the sky a soft shade of gold, just beginning to break over the horizon. I had been awake all night, sitting in the same chair, listening to the clock tick. Each second felt slower, heavier, like time itself was pausing to let me make peace with what I was about to do. When the first light touched the window, I stood up and took one last look around the room. Everything was neatly in place: the bed I barely slept in, the small table where I used to drink my morning coffee, the walls that had heard every silence I swallowed. I didn't feel sadness. I felt stillness, the kind that comes after a storm. My suitcase sat by the door, packed with only what mattered: a few clothes, my medicines, my passport, and the folder of documents that now carried my freedom. The house was still asleep. I could hear David's soft snoring down the hall, the faint hum of the TV left on overnight. For years, that sound had been my prison, proof that life in this house went on even when my existence in it had faded. But that morning it meant nothing. I slipped on my shoes, turned the door handle slowly, and stepped outside. The air hit me like a baptism cold, cleansing, honest. The street was empty except for a few stray cats and the sound of a distant garbage truck. A taxi I had booked hours earlier rolled to a stop in front of the gate. The driver helped me with the suitcase, unaware that he was carrying the last piece of my old life. As we pulled away, I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. The house, the people. The years of giving it all stayed behind like a photograph left in a drawer. Out the window, the city slowly came to life. Coffee shops, opening streetlights, flickering off joggers starting their routines. For them, it was an ordinary morning. For me, it was rebirth. I thought about the irony of it all. For decades, I worked to build a home. Now my peace depended on walking away from it. Freedom, I realized, isn't always found in forgiveness. Sometimes it's in distance. Sometimes to save yourself, you have to leave the people who broke you without ever asking for an apology. As the taxi approached the airport, the sun rose higher, washing the world in gold. I paid the driver, thanked him, and walked toward the terminal, suitcase in hand. The automatic doors opened with a soft hiss, and I stepped inside, feeling lighter than I had in years. When the plane finally took off, I looked out the window and watched the city shrink beneath the clouds. I didn't feel regret or revenge, only release. For the first time in decades, no one was waiting for me to serve, explain, or apologize. I was accountable to no one but myself. That silence, once so heavy, now felt like music. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, letting it fill me. I had walked out of a house that called itself family but felt like captivity. Now I was free, not because I forgave them, but because I finally chose myself. Freedom, I learned that morning, doesn't always arrive with celebration. Sometimes it comes quietly in the back seat of a taxi at dawn, while the world sleeps and you finally wake up. The morning after my departure began like any other for David. The sun filtered through the curtains soft and warm, the kind of light that makes you believe the world is still kind. He yawned, stretched, and shuffled into the kitchen, humming to himself as the coffee brewed. To him, life was steady, predictable. His father, the old man he thought he controlled, was probably still asleep in the small room down the hall. But that morning, the rhythm of his comfort began to break. He reached for his phone to check his account as he did every day. Bills to pay, a few transfers to make. He typed his password, lazily sipping coffee while waiting for the balance to load. Then an error message appeared. He frowned and tried again, this time typing faster. Another error. He muttered to himself, convinced it was a glitch. He switched apps, tried another account. Again, access denied. A flicker of unease passed through him, quick and unfamiliar. He set the mug down and walked to his laptop. He logged in there thinking maybe the phone app was down. But the same message stared back at him, cold and final. Access restricted. Please contact your bank manager. The room felt suddenly smaller. His wife walked in, half awake, asking what was wrong. David forced a laugh and said it was probably a system update. But his voice cracked halfway through. He picked up the phone and called the bank. The call connected after a long minute, and when the familiar voice of the manager greeted him, he exhaled in relief. But what came next froze him. The manager spoke with polite formality, the kind reserved for delivering bad news. He explained that David's access had been permanently revoked. The accounts were now listed under one name, John's. Every signature, every right, every penny had already been transferred the day before. David's hand shook as he demanded an explanation, his voice rising from confusion to panic. The manager's tone didn't change. The decision was legal, irreversible, and fully authorized. There was nothing left for him to access. He hung up and called again, hoping for another answer, another chance. The result was the same. He tried different lines, different employees, different excuses. The truth stayed still. The money he had spent years showing off wasn't his. It never had been. By then his wife had stopped pretending everything was fine. She asked what happened, her voice sharp and scared. He tried to lie, said it was temporary, that his father had made a mistake. But when she pressed for details, his silence betrayed him. He rushed to the bedroom and flung open the door to my room. The bed was neatly made. The closet was empty. My suitcase was gone. Only the faint imprint of where I used to sit remained on the chair by the window. He called my name louder and louder until his voice broke. No answer. Just silence. He tried calling my phone next. It went straight to voicemail. He sent message after message, each one shorter, more desperate than the last. What did you do? Where are you? You can't do this to me. Please, let's talk. But the messages never reached me. By mid-morning, the panic turned to dread. His wife stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, eyes full of questions he couldn't answer. The children whispered in the hallway, sensing something had gone wrong. For the first time, David, the man who mocked his father for needing help, looked helpless himself. He drove to the bank, hoping that seeing someone in person would fix what phone calls couldn't. The staff met him with practiced professionalism, confirming once again that all accounts were now under my sole ownership. His name had been erased from the system. Legally, financially, completely. When he walked out of that bank, he looked smaller, stripped of the arrogance that used to fill his shoulders. The world outside felt different, colder, sharper. People still walked the streets. Cars still passed, life went on. But for David, everything had stopped. Back home, the bills he'd ignored for months suddenly mattered. His wife's eyes hardened with anger. The friends who once borrowed his car or joined his parties stopped answering his calls. The same people who praised him for his success now whispered behind his back. And in that long, suffocating silence, David finally understood the truth. He'd been too proud to see everything he had was built on a foundation he didn't create. The house he flaunted, the money he spent, the life he bragged about it, was all borrowed from the man he called a burden. I wasn't there to see his downfall, but I imagine it clearly, the disbelief turning into fear, the fear into shame, and the shame into a silence even louder than mine. Because in the end, that's how karma works. It doesn't always come crashing down with thunder and flames. Sometimes it just quietly flips the balance sheet. And when it does, you finally learn that respect once lost costs more than any fortune you can ever rebuild. Weeks passed after my disappearance. The days blurred together for David, each one colder than the last. The silence in the house was different now. It wasn't the peaceful quiet that comes after a long day. It was the kind that presses against your chest, reminding you that something is missing. He had tried everything. He called the bank again and again, hoping for some miracle reversal. He visited lawyers, demanded explanations, blamed system errors, even accused the bank of theft. But every conversation ended the same way. The accounts were legitimate, the signatures authentic, the transfers final. He tried to hide the truth from his wife, but lies don't last long when there's no money left to cover them. She began asking questions he couldn't answer. Why the bills were unpaid, why her credit cards stopped working, why his father's phone went straight to voicemail. The more he avoided her eyes, the angrier she became. The arguments turned daily. The house that once felt like his kingdom now echoed with tension. The children learned to stay quiet, sensing their father's temper simmering just beneath the surface. They tiptoed around him, whispering in corners, watching him unravel. Then, one afternoon, the doorbell rang. David opened it to find my lawyer standing there, calm and composed, holding a sealed envelope. The man didn't say much. He only handed over the letter and said, "This is from your father." David stared at it for a long moment, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. His hands trembled as he tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No explanations, no greetings, just two simple sentences written in my handwriting. "You threw water on my face. I drained the life you thought was yours. That was all. No address, no signature, no return. Just silence on paper." He read it once, then again, as if the meaning might change the third time. But it didn't. The message was clear, final, and irreversible. His wife looked over his shoulder, read the words, and walked away without saying a thing. The children stood in the doorway, confused, but sensing something was over. David stood frozen, the letter shaking in his hands. For the first time in his life, he understood what real loss felt like. Not the loss of money or possessions, but the loss of power, respect, and the illusion of control. He tried to call the lawyer back, demanding to know where I was, shouting that it wasn't fair that I couldn't just disappear. The lawyer's response was calm, practiced, and absolute. "Your father made his decision. That's all you need to know." There was nothing left to argue. The line went dead, leaving David standing alone in the living room, surrounded by unpaid bills, silent children, and a wife who had already started emotionally packing her things. That letter didn't just end his comfort, it ended the story he told himself about who he was. The man who mocked his father for needing help was now the one begging for mercy. The man who laughed at humility was now living in it. Days turned to weeks, and the world around him kept shrinking. His wife eventually left, taking the children with her. The house grew emptier, the laughter gone. The silence that used to hum with arrogance now weighed like punishment. He kept the letter, though, folded it neatly and tucked it into his wallet as if carrying it close could somehow undo what it meant. But every time he looked at those words, the reality hit harder. It wasn't just money that I took away, it was the foundation he'd built his pride upon. He finally understood that respect cannot be inherited, only earned. And once it's lost, it never truly comes back. As for me, I didn't need to see his downfall. I had no desire to watch him suffer. My revenge wasn't about his pain, it was about my peace. That letter wasn't a threat. It was closure. A father's final word to a son who forgot what those words meant. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive in a courtroom. Sometimes it comes quietly in an envelope with a truth so sharp it doesn't need explanation. My silence had become his sentence, and that more than anything I could have said was enough. The first morning in my new home didn't feel real at first. I woke to the sound of waves crashing softly against the shore, a rhythm so steady it almost felt like breathing. For the first time in years, I didn't wake to someone's demands or a voice calling my name in irritation. I woke to silence clean open and mine. I rented a small apartment in a quiet coastal town, far from everything and everyone I used to know. The place wasn't grand, but it was peaceful. A single room with a window that faced the ocean. Each morning, sunlight spilled across the floor and the air smelled of salt and possibility. I didn't need much. I had a kettle for tea, a chair by the window, and the soft hum of the sea to remind me I was still alive. I started each day with a walk along the beach. The sand was cool beneath my feet, and the sound of gulls overhead was oddly comforting. I would pass strangers, fishermen, joggers, couples walking their dogs, and we'd exchange a small nod or smile. No one here knew my story. No one looked at me with pity or judgment. To them, I was just another old man enjoying the morning sun. And that anonymity felt like grace. After my walk, I'd stop at a small cafe tucked between two souvenir shops. The owner, a kind woman with laugh lines deep as riverbeds, always saved me a seat by the window. I'd sip my coffee slowly, read the paper, and watch the waves roll in. No one asked about my family. No one called me a burden. The only thing the waitress ever asked was if I wanted a refill. That I realized was what peace truly sounded like, simple questions without hidden meaning. In the afternoons, I cooked small meals for myself. Nothing fancy: grilled fish, rice, vegetables. I'd play the radio quietly in the background and let the hours pass without hurry. Sometimes I'd take out the old photographs I'd brought with me, my wife David as a child, the house when it was still filled with laughter. I didn't look at them with pain anymore. They felt like old chapters from a book I'd already finished. They didn't hurt. They just reminded me of who I had been and how far I'd come. Evenings were my favorite. I'd sit by the window as the sun dipped into the horizon, painting the water gold and crimson. There was something healing in that moment. Something about watching an ending that still felt beautiful. I'd think about everything that had happened, about the silence I once feared, and how it had become my closest friend. Sometimes I thought of David. I wondered if he had learned anything from losing everything. Whether he had understood that respect isn't a favor, it's a responsibility. I didn't wish him pain. I wished him understanding. Because only when you lose what you take for granted do you realize what truly held your life together. I never wrote to him. I never went back. My story with him had already closed, sealed by the same quiet that now filled my days. Some people might call that cold, but to me it was survival. Forgiveness didn't mean returning to the fire, it meant stepping away from it before it burned what little you had left. Here no one called me weak or old or in the way. No one measured my worth by what I could still give. I wasn't someone's father, someone's provider, or someone's shadow. I was simply John, a man who had finally reclaimed his own life. Freedom. I learned doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it looks like a sunrise over the ocean, a cup of hot coffee, and a walk without guilt. It's knowing you don't owe explanations anymore. It's realizing that peace is not something someone gives you, it's something you take back when you decide you deserve it. And maybe, just maybe someday, David will understand that too. He'll realize that power was never in what I gave him, but in what I could take away. When a father leaves, it's not always abandonment. Sometimes it's the only lesson left to teach. As the tide rolled in that evening, I closed my eyes and listened to the waves. Each one sounded like forgiveness, but not the kind you ask for. The kind you give yourself when you finally stop carrying what broke you. I had left behind a house built on disrespect and found a home built on quiet. My life was smaller now, but it finally fit. For the first time in decades, I was free, and that freedom I knew was mine to keep.